Lieutenant Colonel Dwight Reeves pulled Sergeant Elena Vasquez's personnel file from the stack on his desk, held it at arm's length, the way a man holds something he finds faintly distasteful, and dropped it into the trash can beside his chair. He didn't throw it. He dropped it. The difference mattered. Throwing implied effort. Dropping communicated that even the motion of throwing wasn't worth spending on her. "You're in the wrong building," he said without looking up. Vasquez stood at attention in the doorway of his office at Fort Bragg's Special Operations Training Command and said nothing. She had driven 14 hours from Fort Campbell with her evaluation packet, her letter of recommendation from her battalion commander, and a folder of range scores that the examining officer at her previous unit had marked with a single handwritten note at the bottom. "I have never seen anything like this. Request forwarded immediately." She had arrived 20 minutes early. She had signed in at the front desk with the same composed expression she brought to every room she entered, which was the expression of someone who had learned early that how you walk through a door was the first data point you gave people, and she intended to control every data point she could. Reeves finally looked at her. He was 53 years old, barrel-chested, with the particular kind of authority that comes from spending decades in rooms where your authority was never questioned. He had the look of a man who had made up his mind before she walked in and was now simply administering the conclusion. "The Advanced Combat Integration Program," he said, "has a 37% completion rate. Of the candidates who don't finish, 60% don't finish in the first 2 weeks. Do you know why?" "No, sir." "Because they find out what they signed up for." He leaned back in his chair. "I've been running this program for 9 years. I've had Rangers, Green Berets, Marine Raiders. Men who have been through things that don't appear in official after-action reports." He paused. "I've never had a female candidate make it past week 3. Vasquez held his gaze. "With respect, sir, how many female candidates have you had?" Something moved across Reeves's face. Not anger exactly. The thing that precedes anger in a man who isn't accustomed to questions that have good answers. "Enough," he said. She was assigned a rack in the temporary barracks that night. She unpacked her kit in a room that smelled of industrial cleaner and old wood, arranged her gear with the methodical precision her mother had called obsessive when Vasquez was 12, and had called necessary ever since, and sat on the edge of the bunk in the dark for 20 minutes before she slept. She thought about her mother. Not sentimentally, practically. Diane Vasquez had been a trauma surgeon at a county hospital in Albuquerque for 31 years, which meant she had spent 3 decades walking into rooms where something had already gone wrong and being the person responsible for making it go less wrong. She had raised Elena alone after Vasquez's father left when Elena was 4, and she had done it without making the absence of him into a wound she was supposed to carry. "You don't get points for what was done to you," her mother had said once, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for things she considered fundamental. "You get points for what you do next." Vasquez lay down on the bunk and closed her eyes. What she did next started at 0500 the following morning. The Advanced Combat Integration Program was housed at a facility that didn't appear on the public-facing organizational charts of Fort Bragg, which was itself a statement about the kind of training it contained. The program ran 8 weeks. The first 2 were what the instructors called the foundation block, which was a name chosen with the specific intention of making candidates underestimate what was coming. Foundation suggested building. The first 2 weeks were not building. They were excavation. The instructors dug down through everything a candidate thought they were until they found the substrate, the thing underneath the training and the reputation and the self-conception, and then they looked at what that substrate was made of, and they made decisions accordingly. There were 19 candidates on the first morning. Vasquez counted them as they assembled in the pre-dawn dark of the main training area. The same way she counted anything that might matter, quickly, accurately, and without appearing to do it. 16 men, 2 women including herself, and 1 candidate who arrived 3 minutes late and whose expression suggested he knew he was late and had decided that announcing that knowledge through his expression was the appropriate response. The late arrival's name was Okafor. He was a staff sergeant from a ranger battalion, broad and unhurried, with the particular physical ease of someone who had come to terms with the size of his own body and stopped apologizing for it. He fell into formation without comment, stood at attention, and did not look around. Vasquez noted him the way she noted everything. Filed, categorized, not yet assigned a value. The senior instructor for the foundation block was a master sergeant named Dylan. He was not what candidates expected when they imagined someone running a program like this. He was thin, 50-ish, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the quiet, watchful manner of a man who taught high school physics and had opinions about it. He walked out of the operations building at 0500 exactly, stood in front of the assembled class, and said nothing for 60 seconds. 60 seconds is a long time when 19 people are waiting for someone to speak. "I'm going to tell you something that the program documentation doesn't say," Dylan said finally. "This program is not designed to find the best shooters. It's not designed to find the strongest candidates or the fastest or the most decorated. It's designed to find the candidates who can read a situation accurately, under conditions specifically engineered to make accurate reading impossible. Everything else," he said, "is secondary to that." He walked the line slowly. "There are people standing in this formation right now who are better than this program, better trained, better prepared, better suited, and some of those people will not finish." He stopped. Not because the program is unfair, because when the pressure compounds in ways your body hasn't experienced before, some people discover that what they believed about themselves was a story they'd been telling in conditions that hadn't challenged it yet. He was standing in front of Vasquez when he stopped talking. He looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he looked at the candidate beside her. Then he turned and walked to the head of the formation. "Physical block starts in 6 minutes," he said. "I hope you've slept." The next 10 days were what they were. Vasquez had been prepared for hard. She had been through Ranger School, which had its own particular architecture of suffering, and she had come out of it understanding that suffering was not the point. The point was what you did while you were suffering. Whether you kept processing, kept reading the environment, kept making good decisions when your body was telling you to make the one decision that would stop the immediate sensation, which was usually the wrong one. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. What she hadn't expected was the pattern she identified on day 4. It wasn't the instruction that tipped her off. It was the administration, the small things. The way her kit was inventoried twice in the same morning, while other candidates' kits were inventoried once. The way her range scores from the qualification prelims were posted 2 hours later than everyone else's. And when they were posted, the notation beside her entry cited an inconsistency in methodology that wasn't cited anywhere in the rubric documentation she'd been given. The way Reeves appeared at the range on the 3rd morning, which Dylan later mentioned in an offhand way, was unusual, as Reeves didn't typically visit the range during the foundation block. Vasquez stored these observations the way her mother had taught her to store information during a difficult surgery. "Don't react to data," her mother had said once, during a residency rotation when Vasquez had asked how she stayed calm when things went wrong. "Collect it. Data doesn't care about your feelings. Your job is to stay available for the next piece." She collected it and stayed available. The other female candidate was a staff sergeant named Park from a special operations support unit in the Pacific. She was quiet, technically sharp, with a particular stillness to her that Vasquez recognized as something built rather than natural. She'd been in the Army 11 years. She'd applied to this program twice before and been administratively rejected both times on grounds that the paperwork described as scheduling conflicts without further elaboration. She had the look of someone who had decided to stop expecting clarity from institutions and had gotten very good at operating without it. On day 6, Park came and sat beside Vasquez in the mess after the evening training block. She didn't immediately say anything. She poured coffee and held it and looked at the middle distance the way tired people look at nothing. "You saw the scores," she said finally. "Yes," Vasquez said. "Third time that's happened to me across 3 different programs." Park set down her coffee. "I used to file the discrepancy notices." She paused. "Now I just document everything and keep going." Vasquez looked at her. "Why keep going?" Park considered this. She looked like she was choosing between several honest answers, because the only thing that changes anything, she said, is finishing. Not the complaints, not the documentation. Finishing. She picked up her coffee again. "You can't argue with a completed record." Vasquez didn't respond immediately. She thought about what her mother had said at the kitchen table the night before she shipped out for basic. Not the thing parents say when they're trying to be encouraging, but the other thing, the practical thing. "The world will give you every reason to stop before you're done," her mother had said. "Most of those reasons will be real. You'll need to decide in advance that real reasons aren't automatically good reasons. I'm going to finish, Vasquez said. Park looked at her for a moment. I know, she said, with a flatness that suggested she was stating an observation rather than offering encouragement. That's why I sat down. The incident happened in week 2. It started with a navigation exercise, which meant it started with a map, a compass, a series of grid coordinates, and a window of time that was tight but achievable if everything went correctly. Night-land navigation in wooded terrain. Each candidate ran the course individually, leaving from the same start point at 5-minute intervals. Vasquez ran a clean course for the first 4 points. 4th point to 5th point was where the route should have taken her through a creek crossing, at a location marked on the map as a shallow ford. When she arrived at the coordinates, the ford was not where the map indicated. She found it 40 meters downstream, which added time and added a wet crossing that her kit wasn't fully optimized for. She completed the exercise. She came in 4 minutes outside the standard window. It was the only time all week she hadn't finished first or second. In the debrief that followed, the instructor conducting the assessment, a staff sergeant named Ruiz with 12 years in special operations, noted the time without comment and moved on. But Vasquez had examined the map during the exercise, and she had examined it again afterward, and the discrepancy between the marked ford and the actual ford was not a matter of terrain variation. The coordinate notation on her map copy was different by a small but critical margin from the standard notation. Someone had changed the number. Not dramatically, not obviously. The kind of change that you'd have to be looking for. To find, she kept the map. She put it in the inner pocket of her jacket and said nothing. Okafor had run the course 2 intervals ahead of her. He found her the following morning in the equipment bay during the pre-training preparation window. He didn't open with a question. He opened with a statement. Your time last night was off, he said. He wasn't accusatory. He was the opposite of accusatory. He was the tone of a man who has noticed something and decided that the honest thing was to say it rather than not. Yes, Vasquez said. She was going through the function check on her rifle with the automatic care of someone who has done it thousands of times and can do it while conducting a separate cognitive process entirely. I ran the same route 2 intervals ahead of you, he said. The ford was where it was supposed to be when I crossed it. She looked at him then. He held her gaze. He was not someone who looked away from things. I don't know what happened, he said, and I'm not going to say I do. But I was behind the spotting scope during your qualification prelims on day 2, and those scores that went up were not your scores. The equipment bay was empty except for the 2 of them. Through the window, the training area was becoming visible in the early gray of morning. Vasquez asked. Okafor was quiet for a moment. He looked at the middle distance in the way that people look at things they're deciding whether to say. Because I've been watching this program for 2 weeks, he said, and I've been watching you, and I've been telling myself that what I'm seeing isn't what I think it is. He paused. I'm done telling myself that. He walked out of the equipment bay without another word. Vasquez finished the function check and set the rifle down. She sat with what had just happened for 30 seconds, because 30 seconds was what she could afford and what she allowed herself. Then she picked the rifle back up and went to morning formation. She did not file a complaint. She had filed complaints before, in a different unit, in a different state, under different circumstances, and she knew what filing a complaint in a command environment that was looking for reasons to question your fitness accomplished. It accomplished the thing where the complaint became the story instead of the performance, and the performance, the actual performance, was what she had to protect. What she did instead was begin keeping a parallel log, times, scores, discrepancies, observations. Written in a small notebook in her own shorthand, carried in the same inner pocket as the navigation map. Documentation was a kind of ammunition. She had learned that from her mother, who had spent 3 decades in a hospital system that was chronically under-resourced and occasionally hostile to the specific kind of advocacy her patients needed. Write it down, her mother had always said. Write it down with dates and specifics, because your memory is a story and a notebook is a record. And when it matters, records win. Week 3 was when Reeves introduced himself directly into the training environment in a way that couldn't be attributed to coincidence. He appeared at the Week 3 performance review, which was a formal evaluation session where each candidate was assessed on their composite performance across the foundation block and given feedback from the lead instructor in the presence of the program commander. It was a standard evolution. Dylan ran it. Reeves sat at the back of the room and observed. When Vasquez's evaluation came, Dylan delivered the numbers with the same flat precision he brought to everything. Her scores were the highest in the class on the technical and cognitive assessments. Her physical performance was in the top 3. Her navigation accuracy across all exercises except the compromised one was 100%. Reeves spoke up from the back of the room. "The navigation miss is a concern," he said. "Pattern recognition in dynamic terrain is a core competency for this program. A missed objective in a non-adversarial training environment raises questions about operational judgment under stress." Dylan looked at Reeves. It was a brief look, but it had content. "The candidate completed all other navigation objectives with full accuracy," he said. "One miss in this environment," Reeves said, "is different from one miss on a static range." Vasquez sat in the candidate chair in the front of the room and kept her face exactly as it was. Not blank, attentive. The expression of someone who is listening and processing and has made the decision that now is not the time to speak. "Sir," she said when Reeves finished, "I'd like to formally request a copy of the navigation map I was issued for that exercise for comparison against the standard route documentation." Silence. Dylan's pen had been moving across his evaluation sheet. It stopped. Reeves looked at her. The look was the kind that is designed to communicate that the question being asked is not one that gets asked in this room. It was a look that expected her to recognize the communication and adjust accordingly. She held his gaze. "Steady, no heat. That's a reasonable request," Dylan said. The map comparison happened 2 days later in Dylan's office with the logistics sergeant present as documentation witness. The coordinate discrepancies was 4 digits transposed. 4 digits. The kind of thing that could be an administrative error. The kind of thing that wasn't. Dylan looked at the 2 maps side by side for a long time. He asked Vasquez one question. "When did you first notice the discrepancy?" "During the exercise," she said. "I completed the ford crossing downstream and noted the coordinate difference while I was moving." "You noted a coordinate discrepancy while you were wet, in the dark, running a timed course?" "Yes, sir." He nodded once, not with enthusiasm. With the precision of a man acknowledging a correct answer with exactly the acknowledgement it had earned. He told her he would review the documentation and get back to her. She thanked him and left. What happened next was not dramatic. Nothing about the way things changed in the following days was dramatic. Drama would have been easier. Drama would have had a clear moment, a confrontation, a scene where the injustice was named and addressed and the air cleared. What happened instead was quieter and more complicated and ultimately more real. Reeves called her to his office on a Thursday afternoon. She had been expecting it the way you expect weather when the sky has been making a specific kind of announcement all morning. She stood at attention across the desk from him and waited. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked like a man who was sitting with something he hadn't expected to sit with. "The navigation map discrepancy has been classified as a clerical error," he said. "Your time for that exercise will be recalculated against the corrected route. The adjusted result puts you first in the class for that evolution." She said nothing. He looked at her, for the first time since she had walked into his office 2 weeks prior, and watched him drop her file in a trash can. He looked at her without the administrative distance he had maintained between himself and whatever he actually thought about her. "Is there something you want to say?" he said. "No, sir," she said. She paused. "I want to get back to training." Something moved across his face that she didn't have a full name for. He nodded once and dismissed her. She walked out into the afternoon light and stood still for 20 seconds. Not to process, not to feel anything in particular, just to take 20 seconds that were hers, in the open air before she went back. Then she went back. Week 4 arrived with a change in the climate of the class that was hard to measure but impossible to miss. It was the difference between a room that has a temperature and a room that has a weather. Something directional was happening, moving towards something, rather than being held in the static uncertainty of the first 3 weeks. It started with small things. Candidates who had maintained their distance began navigating toward her on the range, not aggressively, not with the self-conscious announcement of making a statement, just with the gradual ease of people who have re-evaluated a proximity and found it less complicated than they'd expected. Questions that had been directed to Dylan or Ruiz started quietly to find their way to her. A recon Marine named Petrov, who had spent 3 weeks maintaining a precise and studied neutrality that was itself a kind of position, came to her before a low-light shooting evolution and said without prelude, "How do you call the wind with this equipment in this terrain?" She told him. She told him in the specific, technical, non-performative way she had learned from 7 years of doing the things she was describing. He listened with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who listen to learn rather than to respond. He ran the evolution with the best combined time and accuracy score in the class. He came back to her afterward and said, "It worked. I know," she said. "How did you know before I ran it?" She thought about it. "Because I've been doing this for 7 years, she said. "And what I just told you is what my mother would call second nature. You have to run it enough times that it stops being a technique and starts being a perception." She paused. "You're almost there." Petrov looked at her for a moment. "Where'd you learn to shoot?" he asked. "New Mexico," she said. "My mother ran an ER. I ran the Arroyos." He nodded as if this explained something he'd been wondering about. Okafor, for his part, said nothing further about what he'd said in the equipment bay. He didn't need to. What he'd said had already happened and had its own momentum. He shot his scores, ran his evolutions, and treated Vasquez the way serious people treat other serious people in environments where seriousness is the currency, with direct, unceremonious regard. Park ran the week 4 block with a quiet ferocity that the instructors noticed and documented and didn't comment on publicly. She finished every evolution in the top 5. On the final day of week 4, she came to Vasquez in the equipment room with the same coffee and middle distance manner she'd brought to the mess on day 6 and said, "Reeves is going to be at the week 5 advanced block." "I know," Vasquez said. "He's going to use it." "He'll try," Vasquez said. Park looked at her for a moment. Something in her expression shifted slightly, the way a careful face shifts when it decides to let something through. "I've done this twice before," she said. "I know what the 5th week looks like." "Tell me," Vasquez said. Park told her. She told her about the compound assessment, which was the week 5 centerpiece, a 72-hour operational scenario that combined everything in the foundation block into a continuous, unbroken evaluation. No reset points, no individual evolutions that could be isolated and assessed independently. Everything running simultaneously, fatigue pounding on the decision-making layer, the environment engineered specifically to find the place where a candidate's judgment started to slip. "The compound assessment is also where they have the most discretion," Park said. "In the individual evolutions, the scores are what they are. Numbers. In the compound assessment, there are judgment calls. What counts as a clean target engagement versus a technically accurate one? What counts as sound navigation versus optimal navigation? The rubric has language like evaluator discretion in it 4 times. Vasquez understood what Park was telling her. "Thank you," she said. Park nodded and left. That night, Vasquez sat alone in the empty barracks for a long time after the others had gone to sleep. She took the photograph from the inner pocket of her jacket, where she kept the navigation map and the notebook. It was a photograph she'd been carrying for 2 years, since the night after her mother's funeral, when she'd gone through the box of things her mother had kept on her desk at the hospital, and found it in an envelope marked only with Vasquez's name. The photograph was of the 2 of them. Vasquez was 9 years old. Her mother was 38. They were standing in the parking lot of the county shooting range, where her mother had taken her every other Saturday from ages 8 to 16, which was the other thing her mother had been that people didn't expect from a trauma surgeon, an exceptional shot. She'd learned from her own father, a Border Patrol agent, who had taken the view that knowing how to shoot was as basic as knowing how to read. And she'd passed that view to her daughter with the same matter-of-fact insistence she brought to everything. In the photograph, Vasquez's mother was pointing at something in the distance, off frame. The girl beside her, age 9, was not looking where her mother pointed. She was looking at her mother's face. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, was a single sentence. Vasquez had read it so many times the paper had softened at the edges. "The shot is only part of it. The other part is deciding you're allowed to take it." She put the photograph back in her pocket and went to sleep. The compound assessment began at 0200 on a Wednesday, 19 candidates. 72 hours. A continuous operational scenario built across 40 square miles of mixed terrain in conditions that had been designed the way a bad week in a bad place is designed, without consideration for the people moving through it. Vasquez moved through it. The first 12 hours were what she'd expected. Physically demanding, cognitively demanding, the accumulated weight of continuous decision-making in conditions that didn't allow for the kind of reorientation that sleep provides. She'd trained for this. She understood the mechanics of it. She went to the place her mother had called with the particular practicality of someone who'd spent decades in emergency medicine, the center. Not calm, her mother had said. Calm is a performance. The center is the part of you that keeps working when everything else is noise. She stayed in the center. The 36-hour mark was when it happened. The scenario included a precision engagement sequence, a night-firing evolution embedded in the middle of the compound assessment at a point specifically calibrated to come after maximum fatigue accumulation. 3 targets at varying distances in complex terrain, the kind of shooting that separated people who were accurate under ideal conditions from people who were accurate under the conditions that actually existed. She set up, did her environmental read, and engaged. First target, confirmed. Second target, confirmed. Third target was at the end of a narrow draw between 2 terrain features that created a specific kind of wind shadow, a protected zone that then opened into an exposed zone at precisely the point where the bullet needed to go. She had seen the phenomenon before in the arroyos of New Mexico when she was 15, learning it from her mother the way everything from her mother came, not as instruction but as demonstration, as watching a person who was already past the place where you're still figuring out the relationship between the thing and yourself. She called the wind wrong on the first calculation. She called it wrong because she was calculating what the wind shadow should do based on the visible indicators, and the visible indicators were giving her the standard answer. She stopped. She started over. She looked past the standard answer to what the terrain was actually doing, which was something slightly different, something that the indicators weren't showing directly, but that the behavior of the dry grass at the base of the draw's far wall was suggesting if you were willing to read what was being suggested rather than what was being said clearly. She adjusted, she fired. Third target, confirmed. When reviewed the compound assessment results 3 days later, Vasquez's composite score was the highest in the class. Not by a small margin. The kind of margin that has a different quality than other margins. Ruiz checked the numbers before Dylan posted them. He checked them the way you check numbers that surprise you methodically, twice, with the expectation of finding an error. He did not find an error. He brought them to Dylan and said nothing, which communicated what his expression communicated. The results went up at 0700. Okafor saw them first. He stood in front of the posting board for a long time, and then he turned around and found Vasquez and said, with the direct efficiency of a man who doesn't waste words on things that don't need them, "You finished first by 8 points. "I know," she said. "In the compound assessment," he said. "Which is the one that matters most?" "I know," she said again. He looked at her for a moment. "Good," he said, and walked away, which for Okafor was an entire speech. Reeves called her to his office that afternoon. She had been expecting it the way you expect a reckoning when the accounting has been building for a long time. He was standing when she entered, looking at the window. The range was visible from where he stood, candidates moving through a technical block in the middle distance, and he watched them with the expression of a man who is using the act of watching to buy time he needs for something else. He turned around. He sat down behind his desk. He looked at the composite scores page, which was open on the desk in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. "You finished first in the compound assessment," he said. "Yes, sir. Highest composite score in the class." "Yes, sir." He was quiet. He was the kind of quiet that has weight in it. "When I was 29 years old," he said finally. And his voice had changed in a way that was hard to characterize exactly, except to say that the commanding officer register was gone and something more basic had taken its place. "I watched a female candidate in my first program break on day 11. Vasquez said nothing. "She was the best candidate class through day 10, Reeves said. "Not marginally. By every measurable metric, she was ahead of everyone else." He paused. "On day 11, she broke. The pressure. Not the physical pressure, the other pressure. The kind that comes at you sideways from directions that aren't in the curriculum." He set the score sheet down. "She never came back to selection. I've spent 18 years telling myself that what happened to her was the program working as designed, that the pressure was legitimate, that if she couldn't take it, she wasn't suited for what came after." He looked at Vasquez directly for the first time since she'd walked in. "I was wrong about that," he said. "And I was wrong about what I've been doing for the last month, and I am aware that saying so does not address what occurred." He paused. "I am not offering it as an apology. I'm offering it as the truth, because the truth is what I've got." The room was quiet. Through the window, the candidates on the range moved through their evolution. Her name was Reyes, he said. She would be 47 now. Vasquez held his gaze for a long moment. I'm sorry about Reyes, she said. She said it the way she meant it, directly, without performance. He nodded. Something in his face moved at a depth that was private and that she didn't try to read. What I did to you, he said, and to Park, and to every candidate who came through here and hit that wall, is not something I can close the account on in a conversation. He picked the score sheet back up. What I can do is this. He turned it over. On the back was a second document, already signed, program commendation, highest composite score in program history, and a formal recommendation for immediate advancement to the senior integration track. He extended it. She took it. The senior track, he said, is where the real work starts. The compound assessment is the qualification. What comes after it is the assignment. He looked at her steadily. Whatever they offer you there, take it. You're past the part where you have to prove anything. She looked at him for a moment. With respect, sir, she said, I don't think I was trying to prove anything. He held her gaze. What were you trying to do? She thought about her mother's handwriting on the back of a photograph. The shot is only part of it. The other part is deciding you're allowed to take it. Finish what I started, she said. Honor a promise. He nodded once, the slow nod of a man receiving information and sitting with it. Dismissed, he said. She walked out into the afternoon. She walked to the far end of the training area, where the range met the tree line, and stopped, and stood in the particular way she stood when she needed to feel the size of something without being required to reduce it to a smaller size in order to manage it. She allowed herself 2 minutes, the full weight of 6 weeks. The tampered maps and the altered scores and the O200 starts and the compound assessment and Dylan's single nod and Okafor's hand on the posting board and Park's face in the mess on day 6. She held all of it at once, which was the only way to hold it that was honest. 2 minutes. Then she took the photograph out of her pocket. Her mother, age 38, pointing at something off frame. The girl who was 9 years old not looking where her mother pointed. Looking at her mother's face, she turned it over. She took a pen from her breast pocket. She stood at the edge of the tree line in the afternoon light, and below her mother's sentence, in her own handwriting, she wrote 4 words. I decided I was. The graduation was the following morning, 17 candidates receiving their qualifications in a ceremony that was efficient and without excess. 3 candidates had not finished the compound assessment. Among those who had, the composite results were posted for the record. When they called Vasquez's name, Okafor started clapping before the formal applause was customary. He clapped with both hands, twice, clean and deliberate, the way Okafor did everything that he actually meant. Petrov clapped. Ruiz, standing with the instructors at the side of the room, set his evaluation clipboard down and brought his hands together in the unhurried way of someone who had stopped caring about what was appropriate for the context. Park, standing 3 positions down the line from Vasquez, did not cry. She stood at attention with her chin up and an expression on her face that was not pride. Exactly. Something older than pride. The expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for something and has watched it happen and knows what it means. Dylan presented the commendation personally. He shook Vasquez's hand. He held it 1 beat longer than formal. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Reeves was at the back of the room. He stood through the entire ceremony with his hands at his sides and watched. When Vasquez received the commendation, he looked at her the way people look at things they are finally letting themselves actually see, without the layer that sits between a person and the truth of something they've been unwilling to look at directly. He didn't clap. He didn't move. But he didn't look away either. That evening, Vasquez sat outside the barracks as the day drained out of the sky. Her kit was already packed. Her orders were processed. The senior integration track was waiting, somewhere else, with its own first morning and its own assessment of what she was before she'd said a word. Park came out and sat beside her. They were quiet for a long time. You going to the senior track? Park asked. Yes, Vasquez said. You? Waiting on orders, Park said. They're being deliberate about it. She said it without bitterness. A weather report. I'll get there. You will, Vasquez said. Okafor came out next, coffee in hand, and sat on the concrete steps without asking if it was all right to sit there, because it clearly was. Petrov came out a few minutes later and leaned against the wall. 2 of the rangers who had barely spoken to Vasquez in 6 weeks came out and sat on the ground, And nobody announced it, and nobody made it formal. And after a while, there were 8 of them sitting in the cooling air, talking about the compound assessment, and then about other things, and then about nothing in particular, which is the specific kind of conversation that happens when people have been through something together and are in the last hours before the something ends. Okafor said, at some point, without looking at anyone in particular, that third target in the draw. What were you reading? Vasquez thought about it. The grass, she said, at the base of the far wall. It was doing something the surface wind wasn't doing. I saw the same thing, he said. I called it wrong. You would have corrected on the second shot. There's no second shot in a real engagement. No, she said. There isn't. She looked at the tree line at the end of the training area. My mother used to say that the shot you take at a given moment is the sum of everything you learned before you got there. If you got the shot right, you got it right because of all the times before it. She paused. If you got it wrong, you've got more learning to do. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Your mother shot? He asked. Better than me until I was about 19, Vasquez said. Then she said,